Empires are not born in glory. They are born in silence when no one is watching. And when too many are looking away, in the long shadow of the Cold War's collapse, Russia teetered on the edge of dissolution. It was drunk on chaos, leaderless in practice, and dismembered in spirit. But then came fire. Then came Grozny. Then came a man the world barely knew, but would never forget. Vladimir Putin, an ex-KGB officer with no charisma, no party, and no name rose, not in a time of triumph, but in a time of smoke and ruin. His rise was not built on popularity, but on a war. A brutal, scorched earth campaign that most Russians never wanted, and few truly understood. And at the center of that war was Chechnya, a land of mountains and blood feuds, where every village could be a fortress and every silence a trap. How did a small breakaway republic in the Caucasus become the crucible that forged the most powerful man in modern Russia? And what did it cost to silence the people and awaken a strong man? The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not bring peace to its former republics. It brought vacuum. Across the vast expanse of Russia's new borders, regions that once answered to Moscow began asking if they needed to anymore. Among them was Chechnya, located in the rugged North Caucasus. Chechnya was a land where history and vengeance walked hand in hand. After centuries of war with Tsarist and Soviet rulers, its people were hardened and suspicious of any flag that flew over them. In 1994, Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first elected president, launched the First Chechen War, attempting to crush the region's bid for independence. He expected a quick, decisive victory. Instead, he got humiliation. The Chechens turned Grozny, their capital, into a death trap. Ill-prepared Russian conscripts were annihilated in street battles. The war dragged on, cost thousands of lives, and exposed the Russian army's deep corruption and incompetence. By 1996, a ceasefire was signed. It brought a shaky peace, but no resolution. Chechnya remained legally part of Russia, but practically ruled itself. And it had become something else entirely, a magnet for radical fighters from across the Islamic world, a breeding ground for warlords, weapons, and Wahhabist ideology, a black hole on Russia's southern border. For Yeltsin, this was an unresolved embarrassment. But for one man inside the Kremlin, it was an opportunity. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer from Leningrad, had quietly worked his way through the corridors of power. By 1998, he was head of the Federal Security Service, the FSB. A year later, he was prime minister. He was not elected. He was installed, but he had a plan, and that plan began with fire and fury. On the 7th of August, 1999, Chechen warlord Shamil Basayev and Arab Islamist Ibn al-Khattab invaded neighboring Dagestan, a republic inside Russia. They declared the start of an Islamic emirate. This was a direct challenge to Moscow and the perfect excuse for war. Putin, as prime minister, demanded sweeping powers to respond. He got them, and for the first time in nearly a decade, the Russian military fought with coordination, speed, and overwhelming force. Within weeks, the insurgents were driven back into Chechnya. But Putin wasn't done. Then, the apartment bombings began. In September 1999, a series of explosions tore through apartment complexes in Moscow, Buyansk, and Volgodonsk, killing over 300 civilians. Russia was in shock. The nation was grieving. The outrage was total. Putin, the new face of law and order, pointed the finger at Chechnya. He promised vengeance, and his approval ratings soared. But behind the headlines, a darker suspicion lingered. Some questioned whether the FSB itself, the agency Putin once led, had staged the attacks as a false flag. In Ryazan, the local police even arrested agents planting what looked like explosives. The story was quickly covered up. To this day, no definitive proof has surfaced. But for Putin, the effect was clear. Rage gave him legitimacy. Terror gave him power. On the 30th of September, 1999, Russian forces crossed into Chechnya again. The Second Chechen War had begun, but this time, there would be no hesitation, no ceasefire. This was war without apology. Russian troops advanced with a new doctrine: no quarter, no caution. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were bombed without warning. Civilian casualties mounted. Putin's message was simple: Chechnya would be crushed, and the Russian Federation would not be broken. By December, Grozny, once again the heart of Chechen resistance, was under siege, and in Moscow, the political tides had turned. Yeltsin, weak and politically toxic, announced his resignation on New Year's Eve. He handed power and immunity from prosecution to Putin. The unknown KGB man was now president of Russia, and his throne was built on the rubble of Grozny. The siege of Grozny in the winter of 1999-2000 became one of the most destructive urban battles in post-war history. To Russian generals, the mistakes of the First War would not be repeated. No more street-by-street bloodshed. No more sending in conscripts unprepared. Instead, the new strategy was clinical and brutal. The city was divided into 15 sectors. Each one would be reconnoitered, mapped, and then obliterated before infantry ever stepped in. Sappers created corridors through the ruins, safe lanes for armor and troops to advance. The actual fighting was carried out by storm detachments of 30 to 50 men, supported by Spetsnaz, BMPs, and heavy artillery. This wasn't a battle of maneuver. It was a slow, methodical annihilation. For the Chechens inside the city, many of them civilians, it was a siege of nightmares. Whole neighborhoods vanished in minutes under Russian shelling. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, unable to flee or even speak openly. Anyone suspected of aiding the resistance faced arrest or worse. Grozny's defenders, composed of both local fighters and foreign jihadists, were forced underground. They relied on tunnels, sniper nests, and nighttime raids, often using captured Russian uniforms to confuse their attackers. At the center of the city was Manuka Square, surrounded by high-rises and shot through with death. It changed hands several times throughout January, sometimes daily. But while the battle raged below, the political game had already been won above. Putin, now acting president, used the chaos to remake the Russian state. He centralized power in the Kremlin. He silenced dissent under the banner of unity. And with every Chechen building that fell, his approval soared higher. In March 2000, Vladimir Putin was elected president of the Russian Federation with over 50% of the vote. He was no longer Yeltsin's heir. He was Russia's future forged in fire and baptized in blood. By February 2000, Grozny was in ruins. The city, once a capital, had been reduced to a field of ash. The United Nations would later call it the most destroyed city on Earth. But the war wasn't over. With the cities pacified, the Russian army moved south into the mountains. There, scattered guerrilla units held out in the forests, passes, and caves, launching ambushes and laying mines. But they were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival. The Kremlin declared victory, but the insurgency persisted for years. more than 16 null Chechen fighters were killed. Russian military deaths officially numbered around 7 ling, but civilian deaths from shelling, executions, starvation may have reached tens of thousands. Both sides committed war crimes. Chechen warlords launched terror attacks in Moscow, Beslan, and the Dubrovka Theater, killing civilians in pursuit of headlines. Russian forces conducted Sakhisky cleansing operations in Chechen villages, where entire populations were arrested, tortured, or executed. But in the halls of power, none of this mattered. Chechnya was declared pacified. A puppet regime was installed in Grozny under Akhmad Kadyrov, a former separatist turned Kremlin loyalist. After his assassination in 2004, his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, a warlord with a personal militia, took his place. To this day, Ramzan rules Chechnya as a near-independent fiefdom under Putin's blessing, and the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, the dream of independence, was buried under rubble. So was any notion of Russian democracy. With the Second Chechen War, Vladimir Putin created the template for his rule: crisis, followed by order, terror, followed by control, a unified Russia. But at what price? When 9/11 occurred, Putin was among the first to call President George W. Bush. But in that call, he didn't just express sympathy. He drew a line. Chechnya, he warned, was not a rebellion, but part of the same global Islamist threat. It worked. The West, once critical of Russian atrocities, turned a blind eye. Chechnya faded from the headlines. And Putin, the wartime president, now had both internal power and international legitimacy. But the insurgency didn't vanish. It simply went quiet and went elsewhere. Former Chechen fighters turned up in Syria, Iraq, and later Ukraine, some as mercenaries, others as ideologues. Inside Russia, the methods honed in Chechnya surveillance, control, intimidation were replicated nationwide. The empire didn't strike back. It bled back into being slowly, viciously, one province at a time. The Chechen Wars taught Putin the most dangerous lesson a leader can learn: violence works if you do it fast enough and deny it long enough. He would apply that lesson again in Georgia in 2008, in Crimea in 2014, in Ukraine in 2022. But Chechnya was the crucible, Grozny was the blueprint, and the world barely noticed until it was too late. 2 decades later, Grozny has been rebuilt. Glass towers, shopping malls, LED-lit boulevards all rise, where ruins once stood. But look closer. The rebuilt city is a stage set, guarded by Kadyrov's personal army, fear rules and whispers, and memory of torture, of bombing, of betrayal hides behind shuttered windows. Chechnya never really surrendered. It simply vanished beneath a mask of order. And Vladimir Putin, he rose from the shadows of that war, cloaked in his fire, made whole by its ashes. Now, the world asks if the man who conquered Grozny will stop at Donbass, or if his first war was also his greatest rehearsal. What happens when the world becomes Chechnya? Empires don't collapse in a moment. They collapse in silence while marching to the sound of their own applause.